All right, let's go. Number 13, the Bent Pyramid. 40 kilometers south of Cairo, at the desert edge of Dashur, stands a pyramid that looks as if it lost its nerve. For the first 50 meters, it climbs at a steep angle, close to 54 degrees, exactly as a pyramid is supposed to. Then, near the halfway point, the slope suddenly relaxes to 43 degrees, and the sides bend inward toward a flatter peak. It is one of the strangest silhouettes in Egypt, and for centuries it was treated as an oddity, a design choice, a builder's whim. It was none of those things. It was a mistake, caught in the middle of happening. The pyramid was built for Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BCE. He was the father of Khufu, the man who would later raise the Great Pyramid at Giza. But Sneferu was working at the very beginning of the smooth-sided pyramid, before anyone knew whether such a shape could stand. The bent pyramid was his attempt to find out. The evidence for what went wrong is written into the structure itself. The lower courses were laid at an angle too steep for the ground beneath them. Inside, the passages show cracked and buckled stones, and heavy timbers wedged in late, as if the builders were trying to hold something together. In 1974, the physicist, Kurt Mendelssohn, argued that the change of angle was a panic correction, prompted by disaster elsewhere. At Meidum, another of Sneferu's pyramids, the outer casing appears to have collapsed, possibly while men were still working on it. Faced with cracks in one pyramid and a slope that felt increasingly unsafe in the other, Sneferu's engineers did the only thing they could. They flattened the angle to take weight off the foundations and finished the monument at a shape it was never meant to have. What survives is not a symbol of triumph. It is a record of a problem being solved in real time, in stone that could not be taken back. The correction worked. Sneferu built a third pyramid nearby, the Red Pyramid, at that same safer 43 degrees, and it stood without trouble. It was the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history, and it made Giza possible. The perfect pyramids the world remembers were built on the back of this failure. The bent pyramid still stands at Dashur, keeping much of its original white limestone casing, one of the best preserved pyramids in Egypt. It has held that casing for 46 centuries. It has also held the bend. The tomb that went wrong is, in a sense, the one that best remembers how the others learned to go right. Number 12. Trepanning. In museum drawers across Europe and South America sit human skulls with neat openings cut into them. Some are round, some square, some scraped into shallow craters the width of a coin. What unsettles the people who study them is not the hole. It is the edge. Around many of these openings, the bone has grown smooth and rounded, sealed over by the body's own healing. That healing only happens in the living. It means the person was alive when the skull was opened, and that they went on living afterward. For months, sometimes for years. The practice is called trepanning, and it is one of the oldest surgeries known. Trepanned skulls have been found from the Neolithic onward, more than 7,000 years old, at sites across France, the Balkans, Russia, China, and the Andes. At some prehistoric cemeteries, 5 to 10% of the skulls carry the marks. This was not a rare last resort. It was a routine part of ancient medicine, performed with flint, obsidian, and later, blades of bronze. Nowhere was it studied more carefully than in Peru. The anthropologist John Verano examined more than 800 trepanned skulls collected there, spanning nearly 2,000 years, and did something no one had done before. He tracked the survival rate over time by reading the healing in the bone. The results describe a civilization teaching itself neurosurgery. Around 400 BCE, only about 4 in 10 patients survived. By the height of the Inca Empire, 1,000 years later, survival had climbed to somewhere between 3/4 and 90%. Surgeons had settled on a careful grooving technique, scoring a circle into the skull and lifting out the central disc without piercing the membrane beneath. Some patients were even fitted with plates of gold. The detail that changes the story is buried in the oldest skulls. The earliest ones show no healing at all. The bone is cut clean and never grew back, which means the patient died on the spot, or within days. The skill that later saved lives was purchased, hole by hole, from the people it first killed. For a long time, it was assumed the openings must be ritual, a way to release spirits, or pressure, or pain. In Peru, the pattern points somewhere more practical. The holes cluster on the left side of the skull, the side a right-handed attacker's club would strike, and many sit beside healed fractures. These were head wounds, and the surgery was an attempt to treat them. The debate is not fully settled, and elsewhere in the world the reasons may have differed. What is certain is the survival. Recorded in bone that closed over an opening, no stone tool should have been able to make safely. The skulls remain in their drawers, the wounds sealed, the names of both the patients and the surgeons long gone. Number 11. The bridge that drowned the fleet that carried it. When the First Punic War began in 264 BCE, Rome was a land power with almost no navy and no tradition of fighting at sea. Carthage, its enemy, was the finest maritime force in the Western Mediterranean, with generations of skill in the ramming and maneuvering that decided ancient sea battles. Rome could not win that kind of fight, so Roman engineers changed the kind of fight it would be. Their solution was a device the Romans called the corvus, the raven. According to the historian Polybius, it was a boarding bridge nearly 11 meters long, mounted on a pivot at the ship's prow, with a heavy iron spike beneath its far end, shaped like a beak. When an enemy vessel drew close, the bridge was dropped, and the spike punched down into the enemy's deck, pinning the two ships together. Then Roman legionaries, the best heavy infantry in the world, simply walked across, and a naval battle became a boarding action. It worked immediately. At Mylae in 260 BCE, Rome's untested fleet destroyed the Carthaginians, and the corvus went on winning. But here's where the advantage turned lethal. The corvus was heavy, and it sat high on the bow, and that weight made the ships unstable in rough water. In 255 BCE, a Roman fleet was caught in a storm off Camarina, on the southern coast of Sicily. Polybius records that of some 360 warships, around 280 were lost, and with them perhaps 100,000 men. By many reckonings, it remains the greatest loss of human life in a single maritime disaster in all of history. 4 years later, another fleet went down in similar circumstances. Modern historians are careful here. Storms sank ancient fleets that carried no corvus at all, and inexperience and overloading played their part. The device cannot bear the entire blame, but the pattern was clear enough to the Romans themselves. After those disasters, the corvus quietly disappears from the record. The battle that finally ended the war at the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE was won without it, by crews who had at last learned to sail. The clever machine that made Rome a naval power also helped send tens of thousands of Roman sailors to the bottom of the sea off Sicily. The corvus vanished so completely that we know it almost entirely from a single written description. The men it capsized left even less. They are somewhere on the seafloor still, in the water between Camarina and the open Mediterranean, a fleet lost not to the enemy, but to its own solution. Number 10. The sweetener the Romans cooked in lead. The Romans had no cane sugar. To sweeten their food and soften the harsh edge of their wine, they relied on a syrup made by boiling down unfermented grape juice. The must pressed straight from the harvest. Reduced by half, it was called defrutum. Reduced to a third, it was called sapa. It was poured into wine, brushed onto fruit to preserve it, and stirred into sauces. The Roman recipe collection attributed to Apicius calls for it in dozens of dishes. It was one of the most ordinary flavors in the Roman kitchen. It was also, in the way it was usually made, a slow poison. The agricultural writers left instructions. Cato, in the oldest surviving Latin prose, tells the cook to reduce the must in a vessel of copper or lead. Columella, writing in the 1st century, is more specific and more damning. The pot, he insists, should be made of lead rather than bronze, because bronze throws off a bad taste, and lead does not. Pliny the Elder describes the same practice. The trouble is chemistry. Grape must is acidic, and when acid is boiled for hours against lead, it draws the metal out and binds it into a compound called lead acetate, still known by its old name, sugar of lead. It is genuinely sweet. Modern recreations of the recipe have produced syrups carrying hundreds of milligrams of lead in every liter. What makes this disturbing is not that the danger was hidden. It is that the danger was the flavor. The lead was not an accidental contaminant leaching in unnoticed. It sweetened the syrup, and that sweetness was the reason the lead pot was chosen over the copper one. For a long time, this fed a dramatic theory that lead poisoning quietly destroyed the Roman Empire, dulling the minds of its ruling class until the whole structure gave way. That version has not held up. Recent reviews point out that the specific vessels are oddly missing from the archaeological record, that most Romans did not drink lead-cooked wine every day, and that empires fall for reasons far larger than any single toxin. Lead did not end Rome, but the exposure itself was real. Roman skeletons carry lead burdens far above those of the peoples who came before them, and the writers themselves describe the tremors and the colic that chronic lead poisoning brings. The taste is long forgotten. The metal is not. It sits in the bones of the Romans who ate it, measurable 2,000 years later in the very skeletons that once enjoyed the sweetness. They cooked their food in the thing that was harming them, and chose to, because it made the wine taste better. Number 9, the king who made himself impossible to poison. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus on the shores of the Black Sea, grew up with a specific fear. His father had been assassinated, and the weapon was poison, slipped into food at a royal table. In the ancient world, poison was the constant instrument of court murder, and a boy who had watched it take his father had every reason to expect it would come for him. Most men in that position simply grew cautious. Mithridates chose a stranger defense. He decided to make his own body immune. He began, according to the ancient accounts, to take poisons himself, in doses too small to kill, increasing them slowly so that his body might learn to endure what would otherwise destroy it. He gathered physicians and herbalists, and some sources say, tested substances on condemned prisoners to see what killed and what could be survived. Out of this work, he was said to have built a universal antidote, a compound of dozens of ingredients that bore his name, the Mithridatium, taken every day as a shield. The recipe, in the versions that survive, ran to strange lengths. Among its ingredients was the blood of ducks from Pontus, which were said to feed on poisonous plants and take no harm, as if their bodies held some protection that could be borrowed. He is remembered now as history's first experimental toxicologist, a man who turned his own body into a laboratory and his kingdom into a supply of subjects. Then came the reckoning. In 63 BCE, after decades of war against Rome, Mithridates was finally cornered, betrayed, his last stronghold lost. Facing capture, he did what a defeated king was expected to do. He took poison. According to the historian Appian, his 2 daughters took it with him, and it killed them. It did not kill him. His body, conditioned by a lifetime of small doses, would not respond to the lethal one. He is said to have tried and failed, and then to have ordered one of his own guards to run him through with a sword. The experiment succeeded. That was the tragedy. It is a story to hold with some caution. Every version of it was written by Romans, or by writers sympathetic to Rome, for whom the Eastern king was both fascinating and foreign, and the details may have grown in the telling. Whether he truly achieved immunity, or whether the failed suicide is an elegant embellishment, cannot now be proven. But the practice was real enough that it left his name in the language, Mithridatism, the building of resistance to a poison by taking a little of it at a time. The antidote outlived the man. Pompey carried the recipe back to Rome as a prize, where the Emperor Nero's physician expanded it into an even more elaborate remedy called theriac. Versions of the Mithridate and its descendants were compounded in the apothecaries of Europe for more than 1,500 years, sold as a guard against every poison, long after anyone remembered the king whose fear had first produced it. The king who spent his life becoming unkillable by poison was killed, in the end, by a blade, because the one death he had prepared for was the only one he could no longer die. Number 8. Las Médulas. In the northwest of Spain, in the province of Leon, there is a landscape that does not look natural, because it is not. Jagged pinnacles of red and orange earth rise out of green chestnut woods, sharp ridges and hollow valleys with no geological reason to exist. The place is called Las Médulas, and it is not a canyon carved by a river or a formation shaped by wind. It is what remains after the Romans tore a range of hills apart to reach the gold inside them. It was, in its time, the largest open-pit gold mine in the entire Roman Empire. The Romans took this region after the conquests under Augustus, near the end of the 1st century BCE, and set about extracting its gold on an industrial scale. The gold was not in veins that could be followed with a pick. It was scattered thinly through vast deposits of compacted gravel and stone. To reach it, the engineers used a method that Pliny the Elder called ruina montium, the wrecking of the mountains. Pliny knew it firsthand. He served as a Roman official in the mining provinces and wrote down what he saw. The technique was audacious, and it began with water. Before a single mountain could be broken, the Romans built a system of aqueducts and channels, some of them running 80 to 100 kilometers back into the wetter highlands, feeding reservoirs poised above the workings. Miners cut networks of narrow tunnels deep into a hillside. Then, the stored water was released all at once into the honeycomb of galleries. Trapped underground with nowhere to go, it blew the hillside apart from within, collapsing whole slopes in a roar of mud and stone that the miners then channeled through washing troughs and sifted for gold. Pliny wrote of the sheer violence of it, of workers who fled the collapses they had set in motion, and he added a note of unease, as if uncertain that men should be doing this to the earth at all. Over roughly 2 centuries, this vast machinery of water and ruin produced only a few tons of gold, poured into the coinage that paid the legions and ran the empire. To win it, an entire landscape was destroyed. What makes Las Médulas hard to look at is not the amount of gold. It is the ratio. A small quantity of metal, most of it long since melted down and spent and scattered, was paid for with the permanent ruin of the mountains that held it. The gold moved on. The wound stayed. The gold is gone now, dispersed into coins and jewelry that vanished into the ordinary churn of history. The mountains never came back. What the Romans left behind is a hollowed, blood-colored terrain that has not healed in 2,000 years, protected today as a World Heritage Site precisely because it is a monument to industrial destruction. You can stand at its edge and see, in the red pinnacles, the exact shape of a decision to treat a mountain as something to be used up. Number 7. The fire that could not be put out, and then could not be remembered. In the year 674, an Arab fleet arrived to besiege Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and the greatest fortified city in the Christian world. The empire was reeling, its eastern provinces already lost, and by every ordinary measure, the city should have fallen. It did not. Out on the water, Byzantine ships met the attackers with a weapon the world had never seen, a liquid fire that shot from tubes mounted on their prows, clung to whatever it touched, burned across the surface of the sea, and could not be extinguished by water. The Arab fleet was destroyed. The name that came down to us for this weapon is Greek fire. The Byzantine chronicler Theophanes credits its invention to a refugee named Callinicos, an architect who had fled the Arab conquest of Syria and brought his secret to the emperor. Its first great success came at the Battle of Cyzicus, near Constantinople, where the fire is said to have broken the Arab fleet. Whether one man truly invented it, or simply perfected something older, the effect was decisive. When the Arabs came again in 717, Greek fire helped shatter that assault too, and it defended Constantinople, on and off, for centuries. Those who faced it compared its terror to nothing else in warfare. It reportedly came out of the siphons with a roar and a cloud of smoke, and the flames, once they caught, could be smothered only with sand, vinegar, or old urine. Water spread them. We know it burned on water. We know it was sprayed under pressure through bronze siphons. We know that it frightened sailors so completely that its reputation alone could turn a fleet away. What we do not know is what it was made of. But here's where the story turns strange. The formula was guarded as one of the deepest secrets of the Byzantine state, known only to the emperors and to the single family that manufactured it, passed down from one generation to the next, and never, it seems, written in full. The secrecy was total, and it was effective. Even enemies who captured the weapon intact could not reproduce it. That secrecy is exactly why the knowledge died. A technology that lives only in the memory of a handful of people is one disaster away from extinction. Somewhere in the long decline of the empire, the chain of that memory broke. The people who knew the recipe passed it to no one, or died before they could, and the formula simply stopped existing. Modern chemists have spent centuries proposing reconstructions, some mixture of petroleum, pine resin, sulfur, perhaps quicklime. None can be confirmed. The single most feared weapon of the medieval world cannot be built today, because no one alive knows how it was made. Greek fire is a rare thing, a piece of knowledge that humanity possessed, used to change the course of history, and then lost completely, not to conquest, but to its own secrecy. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, it fell to another wonder weapon, gunpowder, against which the defenders had no answer. The fire that had once saved the city was, by then, only a story. The siphons survive in old drawings. The terror survives in the chronicles. The formula survives nowhere at all. Number 6. The anatomists who cut into the living. For most of Greek antiquity, the human body was closed to inquiry. A powerful taboo surrounded the corpse. To cut one open was pollution, a violation of the dead, and so the interior of the body remained largely unknown, reasoned about but never seen. Then, for a single brief window in the 3rd century BCE, in the city of Alexandria, that taboo lifted, and 2 men used the opening to do something the ancient world would not attempt again for 1800 years. The men were Herophilus of Chalcedon and his younger colleague Erasistratus. Working under the patronage of the Ptolemaic kings, who had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the world, they performed the first systematic dissections of the human body in Western history. What they found reshaped medicine. Herophilus traced the nerves and understood that they ran to the brain, which he identified as the seat of intelligence rather than the heart. He distinguished the sensory nerves from the motor nerves, and named a junction of veins deep in the skull that still carries his name today. He measured the pulse against a water clock, and gave the first segment of the small intestine the name we still use, the duodenum, for its length of 12 finger breadths. Erasistratus went further into the heart, describing its valves and the flow they controlled. He studied the eye, the liver, the reproductive organs. He separated arteries from veins, and Herophilus is still called the father of anatomy. For the first time, the inside of a human being was being mapped by someone actually looking at it. What makes the achievement unbearable is the account of how some of it was obtained. Later, Roman writers, the medical encyclopedist, Celsus among them, record that the Ptolemies handed Herophilus and Erasistratus condemned criminals out of the prisons, and that the 2 men cut these prisoners open while they were still alive, to observe the living organs at work before death stilled them. Celsus, writing generations later, did not witness it and disapproved of it. The Christian writer Tertullian went further, calling Herophilus a butcher. Whether the vivisections truly happened on the scale described, or whether hostile sources exaggerated, is genuinely disputed by historians. But the reports are old, specific, and consistent, and the atmosphere of Ptolemaic Alexandria makes them difficult to wave away. What is not disputed is how the story ended. The window closed as suddenly as it had opened. After Herophilus and Erasistratus, human dissection stopped and did not resume anywhere in the Western world until the Renaissance, when Vesalius reopened the body in the 16th century. For nearly 2,000 years, medicine relied on the anatomy these two men had recorded, some of it accurate, some of it wrong, and no one went back to check by looking for themselves. The knowledge survived. The people it may have been taken from did not, and their names were never written down. They were criminals, disposable, remembered only as the raw material of an experiment. What Alexandria produced was real and lasting anatomy, and it sits at the foundation of medicine to this day. The unanswerable part is how much of that foundation was laid on the bodies of men who were still breathing when the first cut was made. Number 5. The 20 men in the tunnel. In the 1930s, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Dura-Europos, a Roman frontier city on the Euphrates in what is now Syria, dug into a narrow tunnel beneath the city wall and found the remains of around 20 soldiers. Most were Roman, packed into the cramped space where they had died. For decades, the assumption was simple. The tunnel had collapsed on them, or they had fallen in close fighting underground. The bodies were recorded, and in the way of the time, largely set aside. The truth about how they died would not surface for another 70 years. Around the year 256, Dura-Europos was besieged by the Sasanian Persians, a rising empire pressing hard on Rome's eastern edge. The attackers dug a mine beneath the city wall to bring it down. The Roman defenders heard them and dug a countermine to intercept, aiming to break into the Persian tunnel and drive them off underground. The two tunnels met, and in that meeting, 20 men died in a space barely wide enough to stand. In the 2000s, the archaeologist Simon James re-examined the records left by the site's original excavators, who had dug the siege works beneath a bastion known as Tower 19 in the years before the Second World War. He read the evidence as if the tunnel were a crime scene, and several things did not fit the collapse theory. The Roman bodies had been deliberately stacked into a pile against the tunnel wall, which is not how men fall in a cave-in. They had been arranged, most likely as a barricade behind which the attackers could work. Traces of yellow sulfur crystals and bitumen, a tarry pitch, were found in the tunnel. James's conclusion was disturbing. As the Romans broke through, the Persians were waiting, and they threw sulfur and bitumen onto a brazier, sending a dense cloud of choking gas up into the confined Roman tunnel. Breathed in, that gas turns to acid in the lungs. The Roman soldiers would have collapsed within moments, their retreat blocked by the bodies of the men behind them, and the Persians then fired the tunnel to bring the wall down on top of them. This is an interpretation, not a certainty. No ancient text describes the event, and the story is read entirely from the physical remains. But if James is right, the tunnel under Dura-Europos holds the oldest archaeological evidence of chemical warfare on Earth, a deliberate use of poison gas 17 centuries before the trenches of the First World War. Among the dead was a single Persian soldier, found apart from the rest, in different armor. He was almost certainly the man who released the gas, and it appears to have killed him too, in the dark he had made. The city was taken not long after and abandoned to the desert, which buried it so thoroughly that it became known as the Pompeii of the Syrian sands. The tunnel is still there, and so, it seems, is the chemistry of what happened in it. The faint yellow residue of sulfur and a small pocket of the earth where 20 men learned, before anyone else, what it meant to be killed by the air itself. Number 4, the children raised in silence. The Egyptians, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, believed themselves to be the oldest people on earth. It was a matter of pride and identity, and one pharaoh, Psamtik I, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, wanted to know for certain whether it was true. He devised what may be the first recorded experiment in human psychology, and its subjects were 2 newborn infants. According to Herodotus, Psamtik took 2 babies of common birth and gave them to a shepherd, with a single strict instruction. No one was ever to speak a word in their presence. They were to be fed and kept alive, but raised in total silence. The pharaoh's logic was that language must be innate, and that children who heard no words would eventually speak the original tongue of humankind on their own, revealing which people were truly the eldest. After 2 years, the story goes, the children ran to the shepherd with their hands out, crying a single word, Bekos. It was not Egyptian. It was Phrygian, the word for bread. And so Psamtik concluded reluctantly that the Phrygians and not the Egyptians were the oldest race of all. The tale is almost certainly embellished. The children were far more likely babbling or imitating the bleating of the shepherd's goats than speaking a lost mother tongue. But the disturbing part is not Herodotus's version in which the children live. It is what happened when the same experiment was tried again. In the 13th century, the Friar Salimbene recorded that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II attempted a version of it, raising infants without speech, and by some accounts without any warmth or affection, to see what language would emerge. According to Salimbene, no language emerged at all. The children died. They could not live, he wrote, without the caresses and the tender words that a nurse gives, and so the experiment simply killed them. The same idea surfaces again across history, always with the same cold curiosity. A king of Scotland was said to have tried it and claimed the children spoke Hebrew. The Mughal Emperor Akbar is reported to have sealed infants away with mute nurses in a house of silence. When the doors were opened years later, the children could not speak at all, only gesture. Modern research has confirmed, in the most painful way, what Salimbene claimed. Infants deprived of language and affection do not thrive. They suffer lasting harm to the developing brain, and in the worst historical cases of extreme deprivation, they do not survive. The experiment that was meant to reveal the origin of language revealed something else instead. It revealed how completely a human infant depends on being spoken to. No original language was ever found, because there was never one waiting to be uncovered. What the silent nurseries proved is that speech is not a seed that sprouts on its own. It has to be given, voice to voice, or the child is left with nothing. Whatever the infants in Egypt were really saying 2,500 years ago, the question their rulers asked was answered most clearly by the ones who never got to speak at all. Number 3. The medicine that turned out to be an explosive. In the workshops of Tang Dynasty China, more than 1,000 years ago, Taoist alchemists were engaged in one of the oldest human projects, the search for a drug that would defeat death. They heated minerals and plants together in sealed vessels, believing that the right combination, refined by fire, could produce an elixir that granted immortality. It was patient, meticulous, deeply serious work. And somewhere in the course of it, mixing 3 particular ingredients, they created the most consequential accident in the history of chemistry. The 3 ingredients were saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. Combined and lit, they do not extend life. They burn with sudden violence, and confined, they explode. We know the alchemists discovered this because the earliest written records of the mixture are not recipes, but warnings. Chinese alchemists had been mixing saltpeter and sulfur in their experiments for centuries, at least since the writings of the great alchemist Ge Hong some 500 years earlier. But it was a Taoist text from around the 9th century, later translated by the historian of Chinese science Joseph Needham, that spelled out the danger. It cautions against a specific combination, noting that those who had heated sulfur and saltpeter together had seen flames leap up, had their hands and faces burned, and in some cases had burned down the very buildings they worked in. The knowledge entered history not as a triumph, but as a hazard, a thing the alchemists were telling one another to avoid. They were not trying to make a weapon. They were trying to cheat death, and they had stumbled onto a substance whose entire nature was to deal it out. The Chinese name for the discovery preserves the irony exactly. They called it Huoyao, fire medicine, because it had come out of the medicine cabinet of the immortality seekers. That word, medicine, still lives inside the Chinese term for gunpowder today, a fossil of the moment when the search for eternal life produced its precise opposite. From that accident, everything followed. By the 11th century, the danger had become a design. A Chinese military manual of 1044 recorded the first formulas written down deliberately as weapons, and soon the fire medicine was being packed into bamboo tubes strapped to spears, the earliest fire lances, and then into bombs, rockets, and iron-barreled cannon. Carried west along the trade routes, it reached Europe and remade the entire logic of war. Castle walls that had stood for centuries became obsolete. The armored knight became a target. Empires rose and fell on who could make the powder best and aim it truest. A single class of substance, born from a misfired attempt at longevity, would go on to kill more human beings than almost any invention in history. The alchemists never found their elixir. No one ever has. What they found instead outlived every dynasty that came after them and spread into every corner of the world. And it is with us still, in every mine blast, and every firework, and every gun. The men who lit that first violent flame were reaching for a way to never die. They handed their descendants one of the surest methods ever devised to make certain that others would. Number 2. The fields that turned to salt. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, on the flat southern plains of what is now Iraq, human beings built the first cities on Earth. This was Sumer, the birthplace of writing, of the wheel, of law and kingship and organized religion. None of it would have been possible without one thing: irrigation. The rivers carried water past land that received almost no rain, and by cutting canals to spread that water across the fields, the Sumerians made the desert produce grain in enormous surplus. That surplus fed the priests, the scribes, the soldiers, and the kings. It was, in the truest sense, the experiment that created civilization. And over centuries, that same experiment slowly poisoned the ground it depended on. The problem was invisible at first, and it was built into the method. River water carries dissolved salts. Under a hot sun, water spread across flat fields evaporates quickly, and the salt it carried is left behind in the soil. On land with poor natural drainage, the water table rises with each season of irrigation, drawing yet more salt up toward the surface from below. Season by season, harvest by harvest, the fields grew saltier. There was a remedy in principle, flushing the soil with extra fresh water to wash the salt down and away. But that only works if the water can drain, and on the southern plain, it often could not. Adding more water could make the problem worse. The evidence for what happened is written on clay. In the mid-20th century, the scholars Thorkild Jacobson and Robert McCormick Adams read through the agricultural records the Sumerians themselves had kept, cuneiform tablets logging crops and yields, and found a slow, unmistakable trend. In the earliest period, the fields of southern Mesopotamia grew mostly wheat, but wheat is sensitive to salt. Over the centuries, as the ground grew more saline, the farmers were forced to abandon it in favor of barley, which tolerates salt far better. The tablets record the shift, wheat giving way to barley, until barley was nearly all that would grow, and then the records show the yields themselves beginning to fall, even for the barley, as the salt kept rising. The land did not collapse in a single catastrophe. It failed quietly by degrees, announced in the humblest possible way, a change in which grain a field could bear. The cities of the Deep South, once the center of the world, weakened as their fields gave out, and the balance of power in Mesopotamia drifted north, toward Babylon and beyond, where the soil had not yet been exhausted. Some scholars caution that the tablets are difficult to read as clean agricultural data, and that salinization was one pressure among several rather than a single doom. But the broad pattern holds, and it is sobering. The first great civilization may have undermined its own foundation simply by watering its fields year after year exactly as it was supposed to. You can still see the residue. Across parts of southern Iraq, abandoned ancient fields carry a pale crust of salt on the surface, the visible ghost of water that came and evaporated and came again for 3,000 years. The canals silted up. The cities became mounds of broken brick, half buried in a landscape that no longer feeds anyone the way it once did. The technology that lifted humanity into its first cities was the same technology that, given enough time, quietly salted the earth beneath them. Number 1. The poison the emperors drank to live forever. There is a mineral called cinnabar, a deep arterial red, and to the alchemists of ancient China, it looked like the color of life itself. Heated, it releases a shimmering silver liquid that seems almost alive, flowing and splitting, and refusing to be held. That liquid is mercury, and cinnabar is its ore. To the men who sought the secret of immortality, mercury was miraculous, a metal that behaved like a living thing, that could be driven out of a red stone by fire and coaxed back again, dying and returning at will. If a mineral could pass through death and come back, they reasoned, then perhaps a person who took it into their body could learn to do the same. The reasoning was elegant. The chemistry was lethal. And for nearly 2,000 years, the most powerful men in China swallowed it in the belief that it would make them gods. The elixirs were compounded from mercury, from cinnabar, from arsenic and lead, prepared in secret by court alchemists and taken as pills and tinctures. The results are recorded unmistakably in the official histories. Chronic mercury poisoning produces tremors, madness, organ failure, a slow disintegration of body and mind. And the emperors who took the elixirs suffered exactly these symptoms before they died. During the Tang dynasty alone, at least 5 or 6 emperors are thought to have died from the very drugs meant to keep them alive. One of them, the Emperor Yanzong, grew violent and erratic as the mercury worked on his brain before it finally killed him. And his court, understanding what had happened, still went on serving elixirs to his successors. The practice ran for centuries. It did not truly end until an emperor of the Qing dynasty died the same way in the 18th century, more than 1,000 years after the Tang. But the greatest of these seekers came earlier, and his tomb still holds the proof. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who unified China, who standardized its writing and its roads and began the Great Wall, was consumed by the fear of death. He sent expeditions across the sea in search of the islands of the immortals and the elixir said to grow there. He is believed to have taken mercury preparations himself as medicine in the hope of eternal life. He died in 210 BCE, on a journey, probably poisoned by the very substance he thought would save him, at the age of 49. What makes his story the strangest of all is what he built to hold his body. According to the historian Sima Qian, writing about a century later, the first emperor was buried beneath an enormous mound near modern Xi'an, in an underground palace that took some 700,000 laborers decades to construct. Its ceiling was set with pearls to mirror the night sky, and across its floor ran a map of his entire empire, its 100 rivers, and its seas rendered in flowing liquid mercury, kept in motion by hidden machinery so that the emperor might rule his lands forever from within the earth. For centuries, this was dismissed as legend, the kind of thing court historians invent. Then, modern scientists tested the soil of the burial mound. They found mercury. The soil above the tomb carries concentrations of it far higher than the surrounding land, and later surveys measuring the air over the mound detected the same anomaly. Mercury vapor rising faintly from something sealed below, in a pattern that matches the rivers Sima Qian described. The tomb has never been opened. The central chamber, mapped by instruments, sits intact beneath the mound, and no archaeologist has entered it. In part, this is because the technology to excavate and preserve what lies inside does not yet exist. In part, it is because of the mercury, still there after 22 centuries, still enough to be dangerous. So the first emperor of China lies where he has lain since before the Roman Empire existed, sealed inside a mountain of earth, surrounded by a poisoned map of the world he conquered, guarded by the very metal that killed him. He drank mercury to escape death, and mercury delivered him to it, and mercury surrounds him still, keeping the living out as effectively as it once promised to keep him alive. It is the perfect and terrible summary of the whole pursuit. And it is worth remembering that the same tradition of Chinese alchemy, the same search for the elixir that poisoned these emperors, is the one that stumbled onto gunpowder. Reaching for a way to never die, the alchemists of China found two of the surest ways to die that human beings have ever made: a poison that killed the men who sought eternal life, and a powder that would go on to kill almost everyone else. The mausoleum is quiet now, a green hill above a buried river of silver that no one dares disturb. The man who could not bear to die is still inside it, and after 2,000 years, he has still not been allowed to rest. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.